Before we begin this incredible true story, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss our emotional real-life stories. Now, let's dive into what happened on that unforgettable afternoon. The summer sun beat down on the cobblestone streets of London as tourists filled the area around Buckingham Palace. Among the crowd stood Margaret Henderson, a woman in her late 50s who had traveled from America to see the famous royal guards. She wore expensive sunglasses and carried a designer handbag. Looking every bit like someone used to getting her way, Margaret had spent the morning taking photos and complaining about the heat. Her daughter Sarah walked beside her, quietly apologizing to people her mother bumped into without a second thought. Sarah had learned long ago that her mother believed the world should accommodate her needs, not the other way around. As they approached the palace gates, Margaret noticed one of the Queen's guards standing perfectly still in his iconic red uniform and tall bearskin hat. His name was James Thompson, a young soldier who had served his country with honor for 3 years. He stood at his post with rifle in hand, eyes forward. Maintaining the discipline expected of the royal guards, Margaret's eyes lit up with an idea. She wanted the perfect photo, the kind that would make all her friends jealous back home. She handed her phone to Sarah and walked directly toward the guard, positioning herself right in his path. The guard remained motionless, as his training demanded. Sarah called out nervously, trying to get her mother's attention. Other tourists began to notice what was happening. Some pulled out their phones to record, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. Margaret posed with a huge smile, completely blocking the walkway where the guard was stationed. James felt sweat trickle down his back beneath his heavy uniform. He had dealt with tourists before, but something about this situation felt different. He could see the woman was deliberately standing in his way, treating him like a prop for her vacation photos rather than a soldier performing his duty. Margaret waved her hand dismissively when someone suggested she move. She wanted multiple shots from different angles. She stepped even closer to the guard, invading the space that visitors were supposed to respect. The crowd grew larger, some people shaking their heads at her behavior, while others watched with curiosity. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She knew her mother could be difficult, but this was crossing a line. The guards were not tourist attractions to be played with. They were real soldiers with real responsibilities. But Margaret had never been good at understanding boundaries, especially when she wanted something. James maintained his composure, but inside he was calculating his next move. The guards had protocols for situations like this. They were trained to handle interruptions without breaking their stoic demeanor. However, they also had the authority to take action when necessary. Margaret had no idea that her seemingly harmless photo opportunity was about to take a turn she would never forget. Margaret continued posing for photos, completely unaware of the growing tension around her. She adjusted her sunglasses and smiled wider, treating the situation like a fun adventure. The crowd had grown considerably now, with dozens of people watching and recording on their phones. Some whispered to each other about how disrespectful she was being. James Thompson stood firm, his training taking over. The royal guards were known worldwide for their ability to remain completely still, no matter what happened around them. Tourists had tried everything over the years to make them react, but James was determined not to break his composure. Yet, this woman was testing his patience in a way few others had. A security officer noticed the commotion and began making his way through the crowd. His name was David Mills, and he had worked palace security for over a decade. He had seen countless tourists behave poorly, but blocking a guard's path was particularly problematic. The guards had patrol routes they needed to follow, and this woman was interfering with official duties. Sarah tried one more time to convince her mother to move. She tugged gently on Margaret's sleeve and spoke in a hushed, urgent voice. But Margaret pulled her arm away and told her daughter to stop being so uptight. She insisted she was just having fun and that the guard didn't mind. After all, he wasn't saying anything, was he? David reached the scene and cleared his throat loudly. He politely but firmly informed Margaret that she needed to step back immediately. The guards had responsibilities to fulfill, and visitors were not permitted to obstruct them. His voice was professional, but there was an edge to it that suggested he would not tolerate any arguments, Margaret turned to face him with an indignant expression. She demanded to know why she couldn't take a simple photo. She had paid good money to visit London, and she believed that entitled her to get the pictures she wanted. Other tourists had taken photos with the guards before, so what was the big deal about her doing the same? David explained patiently that while photos from a respectful distance were acceptable, physically blocking a guard's path was not. The guards were on active duty, protecting royal property. They weren't entertainers or museum displays. Margaret rolled her eyes and said she would move in just a minute. After getting a few more shots, that was when James made his decision. According to protocol, if a tourist refused to move after being asked by security, the guard had the authority to take action. He had given her plenty of time. The security officer had issued a clear warning. Now it was time to do his job. The crowd fell silent as James suddenly came to life. In one swift, practiced motion, he stamped his right foot forward with tremendous force. The sound echoed across the courtyard like a thunderclap. He shouted in a booming voice that could be heard across the entire area, commanding everyone to make way. The volume and authority in his voice made several people jump. Margaret stumbled backward in shock, nearly dropping her phone. Her face went pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. She had not expected the silent statue to suddenly roar to life like that. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized she had pushed things too far. The guard's expression remained stern and focused as he prepared to march forward on his patrol route. Margaret's shock quickly turned to anger. How dare this guard embarrass her in front of all these people? She had only been trying to take a photo. There was no need for such dramatic behavior. She stepped forward again, her voice rising as she began to complain loudly about being treated so rudely. James began his march, his boots hitting the cobblestones with precise rhythmic steps. He moved forward exactly as his training dictated, following his patrol route. Margaret was still partly in his way, and she seemed to think he would stop or walk around her. She was wrong. The crowd gasped as James marched directly toward Margaret without slowing down. This was another part of the guard's protocol. They did not deviate from their path. If someone refused to move, the guard would march through their space, and it was up to the person to get out of the way. Margaret realized too late what was happening. She scrambled to the side, nearly tripping over her own feet in her haste. James passed within inches of her, never breaking stride or acknowledging her presence. The crowd erupted in a mixture of gasps, laughter, and applause. Margaret's face turned bright red. This time from humiliation rather than the summer heat, Sarah covered her face with her hands, wishing she could disappear. She had warned her mother, but as usual, Margaret had refused to listen. Now her mother's entitled behavior had been exposed to hundreds of tourists and captured on countless phones. Sarah knew this video would probably end up all over social media within hours. David, security officer, approached Margaret again as James completed his march and returned to his post. David's expression was no longer patient. He informed Margaret in no uncertain terms that she needed to leave the immediate area. If she continued to cause disruptions, she would be escorted off the property entirely and could face additional consequences. Margaret sputtered in protest. She insisted she had done nothing wrong and that the guard had overreacted. She demanded to speak to someone in charge. David calmly replied that he was in charge of this section and his decision was final. She could either move along peacefully or security would remove her. The choice was hers. For a moment, Margaret looked like she might continue arguing. Her mouth opened and closed as she searched for words that would somehow make her the victim in this situation. But the crowd's reaction had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. People were staring at her with disapproval. Some were still filming. Sarah gently took her mother's arm and began guiding her away. She spoke softly, trying to diffuse the situation before it got worse. Margaret resisted at first, but finally allowed herself to be led through the crowd. People parted to let them through, and Margaret could hear whispered comments and barely suppressed laughter. As they walked away, Margaret's mind raced. She had never been treated like this before. In her world, she was important, respected, someone whose complaints were taken seriously. But here, in front of Buckingham Palace, She had been made to look foolish. The sting of embarrassment burned deep. James returned to his position, standing tall and motionless once again. He gave no indication that anything unusual had just occurred. To him, it was simply another day of duty. Another tourist who had learned that the Queen's Guard was not to be trifled with. But he had no idea that this encounter was far from over. Margaret and Sarah found a bench several blocks away. Sarah bought 2 bottles of water from a nearby vendor, while Margaret sat in fuming silence. When Sarah returned, she half expected her mother to launch into a tirade about the unfair treatment. Instead, Margaret sat strangely quiet, staring at the ground with an unreadable expression on her face. That evening, back at their hotel, Margaret remained unusually quiet. Sarah ordered room service for dinner, and they ate in silence. Sarah kept glancing at her mother, worried about what might be going through her mind. Margaret had always been the type to hold grudges and plan revenge for perceived slights. Sarah hoped this time would be different. After dinner, Margaret opened her laptop and began searching for information about the royal guards. Sarah watched nervously, expecting her mother to look for ways to file a complaint. Instead, Margaret seemed genuinely curious, reading article after article about the guards' history, training, and duties. Sarah learned over her mother's shoulder that the guards were active-duty soldiers from elite regiments. They had served in combat zones around the world, including Afghanistan and Iraq. Their ceremonial duties at the palace were just one part of their military service. They were highly trained warriors, not just decorative figures in fancy uniforms. Margaret clicked on a video that explained the guards' protocols. The narrator described how the guards must remain disciplined and follow strict rules while on duty. They were protecting royal residences and could not allow tourists to interfere with their responsibilities. The stamping and shouting that had so startled Margaret was standard procedure for clearing their path. Sarah noticed her mother's expression changing as she read and watched. The indignation seemed to be fading, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. Margaret learned that guards stood for hours in heavy uniforms weighing over 30 pounds, in all weather conditions without breaks. They had to maintain perfect posture and awareness while tourists poked, prodded, and tried to make them laugh. Margaret found an interview with a former guard who described some of the worst behaviors he had witnessed. Tourists had thrown things at guards, made inappropriate gestures, and deliberately tried to make them break protocol. Some had even touched the guards or tried to take their weapons, the former guard explained. How frustrating it was to be treated like an attraction rather than a soldier doing his job. Sarah watched her mother's face carefully. Was it possible that Margaret was actually feeling regret? It would be a first. Margaret had never been good at admitting when she was wrong. She had always found ways to justify her actions or blame others, but something about what she was reading seemed to be getting through to her. Margaret closed the laptop, sat back in her chair. She was quiet for a long moment before speaking. She told Sarah that she hadn't realized the guards were real soldiers. She had thought they were more like actors playing a role for tourists. Sarah resisted the urge to point out that this had been obvious to everyone else. The next morning, Margaret woke up with a strange determination. She told Sarah they were going back to Buckingham Palace. Sarah's heart sank, fearing her mother wanted to cause more trouble. But Margaret insisted she just wanted to see the changing of the guard ceremony properly this time, from an appropriate distance. They arrived at the palace and found a good viewing spot among the crowd. Margaret watched the ceremony with new eyes, noticing details she had missed before. The precision of the movements, the discipline, the pride in every soldier's bearing. These were men who had dedicated their lives to serving their country. After the ceremony, Margaret spotted the same guard from yesterday. James was being relieved from his post and was walking toward the guardhouse. Margaret felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to do something she rarely did. She wanted to apologize. Sarah tried to stop her, explaining that approaching a guard off duty might still be inappropriate. But Margaret was already moving through the crowd. She called out politely, asking if she could speak to him for just a moment. James turned, his expression guarded and professional. James recognized Margaret immediately. He had been briefed that morning about yesterday's incident, as all unusual occurrences were logged and discussed. He had expected never to see this woman again, or if he did, to face more complaints. The last thing he anticipated was what happened next. Margaret took a deep breath and apologized. Her voice was sincere, lacking the entitled tone from the day before. She told James that she had been disrespectful and ignorant. She admitted that she had treated him like a tourist attraction rather than a soldier performing important duties. She said she was sorry for blocking his path and causing a scene. James was genuinely surprised. In his 3 years of service, he could count on one hand the number of times a difficult tourist had returned to apologize. Most people either never realized their behavior was wrong or were too proud to admit it. He studied Margaret's face, looking for signs that this was some kind of trick or setup. But Margaret's expression was honest. She explained that she had spent the evening learning about the guards and their service. She had not understood what the position truly meant. She had thought it was just a ceremonial role. Not realizing that guards were active soldiers who had served in dangerous places and made real sacrifices for their country, Sarah stood beside her mother, barely able to believe what she was hearing. This was not the Margaret Henderson she had known her entire life. Her mother had always been the type to double down when challenged, to insist she was right even when clearly wrong. Yet here she was, admitting fault to a stranger she had no obligation to ever see again. James felt his rigid military bearing soften slightly. He thanked Margaret for coming back and acknowledged that it took courage to admit mistakes. He explained that he had not taken her behavior personally. It was part of the job, and he had dealt with far worse situations. But he appreciated her willingness to learn and change her perspective. Margaret asked if she could ask him a few questions. If he had time, James glanced at his watch and nodded. He had a few minutes before he needed to report for debriefing. Margaret asked about his service. James told her he had served 2 tours overseas before joining the Ceremonial Guard unit. He described some of the challenges and rewards of military life. As they talked, a small crowd began to gather. Some people recognized Margaret from videos of yesterday's incident that had indeed gone viral online. They watched with curiosity as the woman who had been so rude now engaged in respectful conversation with the guards she had. Harassed, Margaret asked James what people should understand about his job. James thought for a moment before responding. He said that people should remember that behind the uniform was a real person who had chosen to serve. The guards stood for hours in uncomfortable conditions, not for attention or praise, but because they believed in duty and service. They deserved basic respect, just like anyone else doing their job. Margaret nodded, truly listening. She told James that she had learned an important lesson. She had traveled the world treating service workers, guards, and staff as if they were beneath her notice. She realized now how wrong that was. Every person deserved respect, regardless of their role. James had given her an unexpected gift by standing his ground yesterday. James smiled slightly. The first break in his professional demeanor. He told Margaret that if everyone who made mistakes had her willingness to learn from them, the world would be a better place. He shook her hand and wished her well on the rest of her trip to London. As he turned to leave, Margaret felt something shift inside her. Sarah linked arms with her mother as they walked away. She was proud of Margaret in a way she had never been before. It was a small moment, but it felt significant. Margaret had always been stubborn and set in her ways. Maybe, just maybe, it was not too late for people to change and grow. That afternoon, Margaret did something else unexpected. She sat down and wrote a letter to the commanding officer of the Guard Regiment, praising James Thompson's professionalism and expressing gratitude for the service of all the guards. She wrote about her own mistakes and the lessons she had learned. She asked that her letter be placed in James's file. The letter was delivered to the regiment headquarters 3 days later. The commanding officer, Colonel Michael Richards, read it with great interest. He had seen the video of the incident circulating online and had been prepared to defend his soldiers' actions if complaints were filed. Instead, he found himself holding a letter of praise and self-reflection. Colonel Richards called James into his office to show him the letter. James read it carefully, moved by Margaret's words. The colonel told him that in his 30 years of military service, he had rarely seen such a turnaround from a member of the public. He commended James for handling the situation by the book and for taking time to speak with the woman afterward. The colonel made a copy of the letter and placed it in James's service record. as Margaret had requested. He also shared the letter with the entire guard unit during their next meeting. He used it as an example of how maintaining professionalism and standards could actually change hearts and minds, rather than just enforcing rules. Meanwhile, Margaret's transformation continued after she returned home to America. She found herself thinking differently about the people she encountered every day. The waiter who brought her coffee, the hotel clerk who checked her in, the security guard at her office building. All of them were real people with their own stories, challenges, and dignity. Sarah noticed the change in her mother immediately. Margaret began saying please and thank you more often. She stopped snapping her fingers to get servers' attention in restaurants. She learned the names of the staff at her regular coffee shop. Small changes, but significant ones for someone who had spent decades treating service workers as invisible. One day, Margaret was at the airport when she witnessed another traveler berating a gate agent over a delayed flight. The traveler's voice was loud and harsh, and the young gate agent looked close to tears. Without thinking, Margaret stepped forward and politely but firmly told the traveler that yelling would not make the plane arrive any faster and that the agent was doing her job. The traveler turned his anger on Margaret, but she stood her ground. She spoke calmly about how everyone deserved respect, even when things did not go as planned. Other passengers began nodding in agreement, and the hostile traveler eventually backed down. The gate agent thanked Margaret with tears in her eyes, saying she had been ready to quit after 2. Many encounters like that one, Margaret thought about James and the lesson he had taught her. Standing your ground and maintaining dignity in the face of disrespect was not easy. She had been on the giving end of that disrespect for too long. Now she understood what it felt like to stand up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable. Sarah shared the story with friends, who could hardly believe Margaret had changed so much. They had known her as difficult and demanding for years. But Sarah insisted it was true. Her mother had experienced something profound at Buckingham Palace, something that had cracked open her hardened perspective and let in some light. 6 months after the incident, this time, she came with a different purpose. She had contacted the military liaison office and arranged to visit the Guard regiment during a family day event. She brought with her a donation to the regiment's charity, which supported soldiers and their families. James was there that day, and he was genuinely happy to see Margaret again. They talked for a while, and Margaret introduced him to her family members who had accompanied her on this trip. She told them the whole story, not hiding her initial bad behavior, but sharing how James had given her a wake-up call she desperately needed. James introduced Margaret to some of his fellow guards, and they shared stories about their service. Margaret listened with genuine interest and respect, asking thoughtful questions. She learned about the sacrifices military families made, the challenges of deployment, and the pride these men took in their duty before leaving. Margaret took a photo with James and several other guards. This time from an appropriate distance and with their permission. She posted the photo online with a caption about respect, growth, and the importance of admitting when you are wrong. The post went viral, just like the original video had. But this time, the message was positive. The story of Margaret and the Royal Guard became an unexpected internet sensation. News outlets picked it up as a feel-good story about redemption and change. Margaret gave several interviews, always emphasizing that she had been completely wrong and that James had done nothing but his job with honor and professionalism. James received recognition from his superiors for his handling of the situation and for the positive attention he had brought to the regiment, but more importantly, he had witnessed something rare, genuine change in another human being. It reminded him why he served, not just to follow orders, but to represent something worth respecting and protecting. Years later, Margaret and James stayed in occasional contact. They exchanged holiday cards and messages. Margaret never forgot the young guard who had refused to compromise his duty, even for a difficult tourist. And James never forgot the woman who had the courage to admit she was wrong and choose to become better. Their brief encounter at Buckingham Palace had changed both of their lives in unexpected ways, proving that sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most unlikely teachers.